This month we're going to be making pinwheel blocks. In your kit you have 7 squares of 30s fabric, and then you have a really big piece of white fabric. We're going to cut all of our squares down to 4.5 inches, and I do have 4 of them stacked up at a time. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. So just like always, I'm cleaning up 2 edges. And then either rotate your mat or walk around if you have them stacked especially. And now I'm going to line up my 4.5 inch mark with my 2 cut edges. And it's later in the pattern that it says to do it, but all of these squares are going to get cut in half twice on the diagonal, so I'm just going to do it now while I have them sitting here. So I'm lining up point to point. If you want to, you can line up your 45-degree line as well. Now, if I'm careful and don't move it, I can cut the other way too. I mean, you're going to have to do it anyway. These are oversized slightly. So we're going to do that with all 7 of our 30s prints. From my white piece, I need 7 4.5 inch wide strips by about 14 inches. And it's actually a little bit more on the width. I'm just going to cut 4.5 inch strips from that. I've already straightened one of my short edges, well actually 2 of them, because I have this folded in half so I can cut 2 at a time. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. So I'm just going to cut 4.5 inch strips from this, and my rulers are not back wide enough to do that trick where I'm working backwards. So I will be cutting, moving, cutting, moving. So it's the 4.5 inch mark on the long edge, and I'll finish cutting these off camera. So from each of those strips, we should get 3 4.5 inch squares easily. So 4.5 times 3 is 13.5. So I'm going to line my 13.5 inch mark up with the edge, my short edge that I just cleaned it. Well, I did just clean it up. Okay, 13.5 with the short edge. And actually it's not as straight as I would like, so I'm going to switch down to the other end. It's a little bit longer than you need, so you can do that. Okay. It's 13.5 on my short end, any long straight line on my long edges. That piece is scrap. I'm going to back up to 9 inches. And cut, and then to 4.5 inches. So my 4.5 inch mark is on my short edge, any straight lines along my long edges, and cut. Now we're going to get 21 squares out of this white. We're going to save 14 of them in this size, and 7 of them we're going to cut in half on the diagonal, just like we did with our colored squares. So remember, you're saving 14, not cutting them beyond this. You're keeping them at the 4.5 inches square. And 7 of them we're cutting twice on the diagonal to make 4 triangles from each square. So go ahead and cut all of those. Now we're going to take all of our colored triangles and pair them up with a white triangle. My white triangle should be on the left and my colored should be on the right. And make sure that it's the long edge out here on the diagonal. You're going to be sewing the short edges together, and it should be short edges across the bottom, so vertical and horizontal across the bottom. And we're going to do that with all 28 triangles that we have. Do be careful. This is bias we're sewing on, so don't stretch it. I did spray my pieces with Best Press before I started, and pressed it dry so that they're a little bit more stable, but you still need to be careful. I've stitched all my white and colored triangles together, and then I pressed toward the colored triangle. Do be careful when you're pressing because this edge is still biased. So remember, it's an up and down motion, not a back and forth motion. So once I have all those pressed, then I'm going to take my 4.5 inch white squares, and I'm going to take these triangles and I want to line them up. My point going into a point. I'm going to line up my edges here, and you're going to have a little bit extra in here, so if you have just a hair showing here, that's fine because we're going to be trimming down, and I'm going to do it on both corners. And then I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch away from my triangle edge on both of these. So here's one that I've already stitched. So if I flip it up, then that's what it looks like. And once I have them all stitched, I'm going to go ahead and cut them apart. You could use a rotary cutter if you want, or just scissors, it doesn't matter. So you're going to have a little bit of waste right there in the center. Okay, and then I am going to press toward the large white triangle, so like that. So we're going to end up with 28 units that look like that. I've made my 28 units, and I did press toward the white triangle. Now I need to trim all these down to 3.5 inches. Half of 3.5 is 1 3/4, so I want the 1 3/4 mark right here to be on my center point. You're using a square ruler, then you should have a 45-degree line that you can run along the long seam. So when I'm sure I've got my 1 3/4 there, got my line running along the seam, I'm going to cut and cut, and then I can rotate the block or I can walk around. And now I'm going to put my 3.5 inch mark on my two edges that I just cut. And again, my 1 3/4 really should be on that point, and my diagonal line can be on the seam. And cut and cut so that they will look like this. The square ruler works just fine for trimming this up, but if you have a Tucker trimmer, that will work as well. We're cutting to 3.5, so we would be using the dotted lines over here. Notice it also has a 45-degree line. So with this one, I'm going to put my 3.5 mark running along this seam. I also have another line that I'm going to put on the seam in my half square triangles or my quarter square triangles. And trim, trim, rotate. And now my 3.5 mark is going to be on my two edges that I just cut. And trim. So either way, it gets you the same results. You just need to decide which one you'd rather do. All my units are trimmed down, so now it's just a matter of sewing these together into a 4-patch. You just need to arrange them to be sure that you're getting the pinwheel. So I will sew it together into 2 rows, and actually both rows are exactly the same. If you flipped this one over, it's going to be the same thing. I've sewn the pairs together, and then you just need to decide which way you want to press, and press all of them the same direction. I pressed toward the bigger white triangle, but it would be just fine to press the other way. So now I'm ready to sew my rows together, and my only point that I need to match is right here in the center. And while it may interlock in that spot, just to be sure, you can put a pin right through that intersection. I want to check on the other side to make sure it's really going through it, and then through the intersection on this side. So straight through. Don't try to bend that, tip that pin and pin with it. It's just holding our center points. We're going to take another pin and pin on both sides of that intersection. And now we can take this one out. So when I'm sewing, I want to just hit that intersection so that I keep my points and everything meets up in the center. So I will sew all 7 sets together. So I've sewn all 7 of my pinwheels together. I did pop the center seam so I get a little tiny pinwheel in the center. It took me probably about somewhere around 2.5 hours to make all of these. So I know it's December, but if you will start early, it can be done in stages.